life had been turned upside down on the day she was to get married. Finally, she was going to marry her dream man. All she ever wanted was to be with him at the altar until he made a shocking announcement. As the day progressed, it slowly became a nightmare. Never in her wildest dreams did she imagine something like this would happen to her. Linda and Eric met at a mutual friend's party, and there was an instant attraction between them. They talked for hours, and the chemistry between them was undeniable. Linda never thought she would be finding love at her age again. She was nearing 55, but she was young at heart. Eric, on the other hand, was 31, and the age difference never bothered them. They only had eyes for each other. After that night, they started dating, and it didn't take long before they fell in love. They spent every moment they could together, and it wasn't long before they moved in together. Linda's friends and family cautioned her about moving too fast with the relationship, but the couple was happy, and Linda never suspected that her boyfriend would be keeping secrets. Eventually, Eric plucked up the courage to propose to Linda. He planned the whole day with the help of her closest friends and family. Although most of them had reservations, it was Linda's daughter, Nikki, that was their biggest supporter. Nikki was Linda's youngest daughter, and the two of them had a shaky relationship at times. But on this occasion, Nikki was excited about her mother's happiness and couldn't wait for the wedding day. Arrangements were made for the special proposal. Nikki thought it would be best to do it at her mother's favorite lookout spot. Arrangements were made for lunch and flowers at the table. There was no doubt that it would be the perfect proposal. Linda, of course, said yes. She became so engrossed in the wedding preparations that she didn't even notice what was happening. Linda felt like she was floating on cloud 9. Her friends were happy for her but couldn't believe she had accepted Eric's proposal after just 3 months of dating. They had warned her about moving too fast. Eric was younger than her and looked like he had a bit of a roving eye. Linda brushed off all warnings. She was not going to let anyone ruin her happiness. She was pushing 60, and she thought this was her last chance at love. After having Nikki, Linda's second marriage failed, and she always felt that she never really met the right person, until Eric walked into her life. He was sweet and loving, and was everything she could ask for in a man. She had this feeling about him, and the saying, 3 times a charm, popped into her mind. She was going to give this a try no matter what. Planning the wedding was both exciting and tiring, but at least Linda had Nikki's help. She was relieved to see that their relationship was flourishing. She was grateful that Nikki helped her and thought of the things that she had forgotten about. The mother-daughter relationship was back on track. Nikki was showing a different side of herself, and Linda had forgotten that they had similar personalities. They liked the same things, and so it became easier to plan the wedding because whatever Nikki chose, Linda loved. They were a great team, and Linda couldn't be happier having her daughter by her side. The color scheme they chose was blue because it was Linda's favorite color, and she couldn't wait to see the venue decked out in different shades of blue. During one of Nikki's doctor's appointments, her mom accompanied her. Her mom had been supporting her for a while since she had been sick. At that point, Linda and Nikki would receive some unexpected news. Nikki was 6 weeks pregnant at the time. Linda was overjoyed to become a grandmother. It was obvious, however, that Nikki was not looking happy. Linda assured Nikki that it was a joyous moment in their lives. She reminded her that when she was younger, she always wanted to be a mommy. Linda liked Nikki's boyfriend Bruce a lot. He was a decent guy, and she always thought they were great together. However, she didn't know their relationship was that serious. The wedding was inching closer, with only a week to go. Linda's nerves were shot, but her loving fiancé was always reassuring her that everything would be fine. With all the planning of the wedding, Linda and Eric hardly spent proper time together as a newly engaged couple. Eric was a hard worker, and he always worked late hours and couldn't really make time to see Linda in the evenings as she would be tired from her day of planning. Linda became worried about her relationship at one point. It had been a while since they had spent quality time together. It dispelled all fears and doubts in her mind to know that she was marrying Eric in a week. Once they became man and wife, they would spend all their time together. If only she had trusted her gut. Finally, it was the day before the wedding, and Linda was floating on air. She had all her friends come over for a pre-wedding brunch party. She was so excited about the wedding. She couldn't be happier with the menu and the cake. Even though she had chosen everything herself, she was positive that Eric was going to love everything when he saw it. All her friends' boyfriends and husbands were also invited to the brunch party, and Linda and Eric were showing off their love to everyone who had doubted them. Linda stood proud. Every single one of them had their doubts, but only one of them would be proven right in the end. And on the wedding day, they would find out who that was. Would it be Linda? Their wedding day would seal the deal. And all of those people would be proven wrong. Age was just a number. Linda knew that. She saw it in the way she felt about Eric and the way he acted when he was with her. But she had no idea how wrong she really was about Eric and his feelings. During the festivities, Linda could see that Eric was on edge. He was distant and distracted by something. He was constantly looking at his phone. He wasn't acting like his usual self, and that concerned Linda. What was he waiting for? When she found out what was really going on, all her hopes would go up in flames. Linda asked Eric if he was okay, and he just brushed off his distraction. He claimed that he was just tired and overwhelmed by the wedding that would be taking place the next day. Linda was worried. She wasn't convinced by his answer and wanted to know the truth, but she had no time to push the matter. Little did she know that she'd have her answers sooner than expected. The wedding day had finally arrived. Linda couldn't believe that it was finally happening. She was excited, nervous, and happy all at the same time. But she was completely unaware of what was happening behind the scenes, and when she found out, her world would come crashing down around her. It was only a matter of time before she found out what Eric was really up to. Linda was getting ready with her bridesmaids. As she was busy putting on her wedding dress, she thought about Eric. She couldn't wait to see him waiting for her at the altar, but she still had a nagging feeling of worry lurking at the back of her mind. Linda couldn't put her finger on it, but it felt like this day would end in disaster. Linda convinced herself that it was just her nerves that were acting up. This would be her third wedding, and since the other two ended in disaster, she couldn't help but wonder if this would be the same. But Linda was making a mistake when she tried to suppress her feelings and concerns. They were trying to warn her, but she wouldn't listen. Linda looked out the window from where she was getting ready. They were to exchange vows outside in a beautiful garden setting, and Eric was already standing there, waiting for her. He looked gorgeous in the suit she picked out for him. But something was destroying the moment of bliss. There was concern etched into his face. The look reminded Linda of his behavior at the party the day before, and she couldn't help but wonder if the two were related. Was he having cold feet? Had he considered walking out on her? Linda wasn't sure, and that was what bothered her the most. She couldn't stand having her heart broken again. Linda was drawn from her thoughts by her bridesmaids, who wanted to show her what she looked like in her gorgeous gown. Linda watched herself, amazed by the image the mirror portrayed. She looked gorgeous. It was unlike the other wedding dresses she had worn before, and that made her feel incredibly good about the road ahead. As Linda stood there admiring herself, all her fears about Eric and the wedding melted away. She was determined to make things work this time around, and she would do whatever it took for this marriage to last. But Linda was already too late. The damage had been done, and it was something they could never turn back from. Linda cried tears of joy. She was finally getting her happily ever after. This was her moment, and she was going to prove that no matter your age you can still find love. But that would soon change for Linda. As soon as she walked down that aisle, she would learn the truth. And it was far more tragic than she ever thought it would be. It was time. Linda asked her son Brandon to walk her down the aisle. She was pleased to have her 2 children by her side. Nikki was her maid of honor, of course. She stepped out of the massive doors as the bridal music started playing, and suddenly all eyes were on her. It was the wedding she had always dreamed of, but it wouldn't end that way. Linda couldn't ask for a more perfect day. The love of her life was standing right in front of her as she practically floated down the aisle. He looked incredibly happy, and Linda thought it was because they would finally be saying "I do," but she quickly realized that his attention wasn't on her. It was on someone else. Eric's eyes were on the aisle, but he was looking right past Linda. His attention was focused on what was going on behind her. She thought something might have happened, so she looked. But there was absolutely nothing there. The only thing behind her was her bridesmaids, who were making sure her dress flowed as she walked. She missed the most important piece of the puzzle. There was something about Eric that didn't look right. His face looked troubled, and Linda could feel that something was wrong. She thought it might have been his nerves, but she would soon learn that it wasn't the case. Everything she thought she knew was wrong, and he couldn't have picked a worse time to prove to all her friends how right they were. Linda picked up her pace, hoping to find out what was going on. She was no longer the excited bride-to-be she was a few minutes before. She was the concerned fiancée had been for the last few weeks. But Linda had no idea what she was walking into. Perhaps it would have been better if she didn't know the truth at all. When Linda finally reached the altar, Eric turned to her and said, "Linda, there's something I need to tell you." "Now is not the time for lengthy discussions," Linda said through gritted teeth. She had no idea that his words would change everything. "We need to stop the wedding," Eric said loud enough for all the guests to hear. The guests gasped in horror, and Linda's heart sank. It was the moment of truth. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. That nagging feeling had been warning her of something, and this was it. But Linda had no idea how bad the situation really was. This was just the beginning of their destruction. Eric started by saying, "I'm sorry, Linda, but I can't go through with this. I've realized that I'm in love with someone else." His gaze moved past her, but Linda was frozen in place. She was so shocked that she couldn't turn to see who he was talking about. "Please forgive me," he said with big, pleading eyes. Linda grabbed Eric's sleeve and pulled him closer. "Are you serious?" she asked as she tried to comprehend what she had just heard. "I'm afraid I am," Eric whispered. "I didn't mean for this to happen. It just did, and then I found out. There's absolutely no way I can walk away from her. And I don't think I want to either." Linda was devastated. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. How could Eric do this to her on their wedding day? She felt like her whole world had come crashing down around her. All she wanted to do was cry her eyes out, to express the pain while trying to find a way to fix things. But she was completely frozen in place. "Why didn't you tell me this before I walked down the aisle?" Linda asked as a tinge of rosy color spread across her pale white cheeks. She had never been this embarrassed in her life. "I was still considering my options. But I couldn't wait any longer than this," Eric said, looking as boyish as ever. Linda stared at Eric in disbelief. She had given everything to him. She had trusted him completely. She had ignored all the warning signs and had gone ahead with the wedding, only to be betrayed on her big day. How could he wait until they were standing at the altar? Why didn't he come to her before? The truth was that Linda couldn't believe a word Eric was saying at the time. She wasn't sure how much of their relationship had been a lie. She didn't know if there was any truth to it at all. In her opinion, he was acting like a child. He didn't have to wait this long to make up his mind. He didn't have to embarrass her in front of all her friends and family members. She couldn't help but think that maybe her friends and family were right. Maybe she had moved too fast and had been blinded by her love for Eric. But Linda hadn't heard the entire truth yet. The biggest secret was yet to be revealed, and it would be a bigger blow than she could ever imagine. Linda didn't know what to do. She was in shock and didn't know how to react. Eric had just confessed his love for someone else, and she didn't know where to go from there. Should she confront him? Should she call him out on his childish behavior? Or should she just walk away and keep her dignity intact? The guests were murmuring amongst themselves, and Linda could hear whispers of pity and sympathy. She just wanted to disappear. How could she ever face these people again? Linda was done. She wanted nothing more than for that dreadful day to be over with. But it was far from over. If she only knew what was coming next. Linda looked over at Nikki, who was in tears. She couldn't imagine how her daughter was feeling. She had helped her mom plan it all just to watch her mother's dream wedding turn into a nightmare. The poor girl must have been devastated. But the truth was that Nikki's tears had nothing to do with Linda's misfortune. Nikki had a major secret of her own, and the whole incident at the wedding was forcing her to come clean. She had hoped to keep it a secret for the rest of her life. But everything came out eventually, and Nikki was being forced to hurt her mother more than Eric ever could. What was she hiding? Nikki came over to her and hugged her mother, and Linda realized that she still had her family and friends to support her. Even if Eric had betrayed her, she still had people who loved her. That statement was very true. But those people weren't who she thought they were. And when Linda uncovered the real truth, she would know how wrong she was. After a few moments of silence, Linda composed herself and turned to Eric. "I think everyone knows this wedding is called off," she said as calmly as she could. Eric opened his mouth to speak, but Linda gave him a pointed look, and he closed it once more. There was nothing he could do to save this anymore. Eric looked down, ashamed, and nodded. The guests started to leave, and Linda was left alone with her thoughts. She returned to the bridal suite so she could regain her composure. But this story was far from over. What Linda didn't know was that her heart was about to be trampled on for a second time. Linda sat down at the dresser and slowly started pulling the bobby pins out of her hair. This day has been a disaster in every sense of the word. But it wasn't over yet. She washed off the smeared makeup that marred her face and slipped out of the gown. It was finally over. She could finally go home and wallow in her sorrows. What Linda didn't know was that things were about to get even worse for her. She changed her clothes, grabbed her handbag, and left the venue. But as she was on her way out, something got her attention. It was Nikki, and she was crying even more than she did during the disaster that was the ceremony. Nikki ran toward her mother, and Linda could tell that something was wrong. Nikki looked pale and distressed. It was so unlike her usual self that it stood out from a mile away. Linda rushed up to her daughter, thinking that something might have happened to her or the baby. But Linda was in for yet another surprise, and this one would hurt more than the rest. Nikki took a deep breath and said, "Mom, there's something I need to tell you." Linda braced herself for what was to come. "Nikki, what is it?" "Is the baby okay?" Linda asked, her voice trembling. Nikki nodded, but she looked even worse than she did before. What she was about to say would crush Linda. Linda took her hands and held her daughter. She could see that something was bothering her. And then the bomb dropped. Nikki looked down and said, "Eric and we had an affair. I'm pregnant with his child." Linda let out a strangled laugh, unable to comprehend what her daughter had just said. Was it some kind of sick joke? When Nikki realized that her words weren't piercing through the fog that was clouding her mother's mind, she pulled Linda aside. "It was an accident," Nikki said, hoping to explain her actions. "I was drunk. I never meant for things to go so far, but they did, and I can't go back to stop it." Linda pulled away from her daughter. She knew kids made mistakes and that they didn't always think of the consequences. But this was one mistake they couldn't move away from. Her fiancé cheated on her with her own daughter, and in the process he got her pregnant. Then he left Linda at the altar because he had fallen in love. It was too much for her to handle at that point. So Linda pulled herself together, got in her car, and drove off without saying another word. She was heading for the airport, where her flight to Hawaii was waiting. She'd already paid for the tickets, so she might as well get something good out of this situation. Plus, she needed some time to think things through and recover. Linda was far too early for her flight, but she booked in nonetheless and took that time to reflect on what had happened. She had finally built bridges with her daughter. Was she willing to break them over a man? It was something she really needed to consider before she faced either of them again. Linda replayed Nikki's words over and over again, and after a few hours of mulling it over, they finally sank it. The moment she realized what her daughter truly said, Linda felt like her world was collapsing around her. She couldn't believe that such a small mistake could have such dire consequences. But was Nikki really to blame? Nikki said she was drunk, which wasn't hard to believe since she saw the wedding planning as a well-earned vacation. She was drinking from noon to midnight. With the number of mimosas that went down, Linda was surprised the girl could see straight. But what about Eric? Was he using Nikki's vulnerability to his advantage? Linda looked at her phone. There were 20 missed calls and 7 messages from her daughter. Nikki was trying her best to earn her mother's forgiveness. But was Linda ready to give it? She wasn't sure of that. So she just turned off her phone and waited for her flight number to be called. She'd deal with the rest in 2 weeks when she got back from her vacation. After a week of soaking up the sun, Linda turned her attention back to her daughter and the father of the child. Linda was still furious about what happened, and she still had a ton of questions. But she knew for a fact that her grandchild would suffer if she didn't step up. Nikki could barely keep a job, and she hadn't even moved out of the house yet. As for Eric, he still had Linda's mind racing with questions. How long had this been going on? Did Eric know that he was being intimate with Nikki, or was he just as drunk as she was? Linda was filled with anger and confusion. She could understand Nikki's side of the story, but she couldn't understand his. He promised to be responsible and to love her no matter what. Yet, he betrayed her. But above all else, she was devastated that the man she loved had cheated on her with her own flesh and blood. The father of her daughter's unborn child was the same man who had promised to love and cherish her. It was a complete disaster, and her family was at the center of it all. The pain he made her feel was something that would take a very long time to heal. But she had to respect their decisions as they had to respect hers. If Nikki wanted the man in her life, there was nothing Linda could do to stop it. But that didn't mean she had to forgive him for what he had done. She could hate him and respect the fact that he was the father of her grandchild. At least that way Linda could have her grandchild in her life, and that was something she had always wanted. None of her other children were ready for kids, and she had given up on the hope of ever spoiling one again. But now, maybe there was a silver lining to this whole situation. She did get a grandchild out of it, after all. With her mind made up, Linda went home. But she still had a lot of things to sort out. She had to apologize to her friends and family members and to admit that they were right. Plus, she had to find out what Nikki wanted to do and how she planned on taking care of her little mistake. She knew the road ahead would be a stressful one. But Linda was ready to face it. When she returned home, Linda leaned on her family and friends for support. She was grateful for their love and encouragement during such a difficult time. Her friends had been there for her, even though they could have rubbed the whole incident in her face. But instead of stooping so low, they helped her pick up the pieces. As for Eric and Nikki, they had decided to give being a couple a shot. Eric did claim to love the girl after all, and Linda knew that he was a great man when he was in love. She just hoped that someone would make good out of the mess the two of them had created. As time passed, Linda started to feel like herself again. She went out with friends, took up new hobbies, and focused on her company. And she supported her daughter throughout her pregnancy. But she wasn't so lenient this time around. If Eric wanted to be a father, he had to prove he had what it took. Over the next few months, Eric tried his best to earn Linda's forgiveness, and Nikki did the same. Whenever her mother needed something, she would be there. But it didn't help the heartache Linda still felt. Being close to them was hard, and the amount of attention they were giving her wasn't helping. But that was about to change. The moment Nikki gave birth and that baby was placed in Linda's arms, the past melted away. She had put up with the pain and heartache for a reason, and now that it was finally there, she couldn't be happier. That little baby that was cradled in her arms was everything she needed and so much more. Disclaimer: in order to protect the privacy of those depicted, some names, locations, and identifying characteristics have been changed and are products of the author's imagination. Any resemblances to actual events or places or persons, living or dead, are entirely coincidental.